Greetings. Welcome to another episode of Well, Why Not? And as the title states, this episode is going to be about why I love working in Latin America. I actually will be balancing everything I love with the downside to that thing that I love, but I didn't want to put that in the title because it's actually all very positive. There's no perfect situation, no perfect country, no perfect place. And there's just so much that I enjoy. I'm not sure how I would fare going back to a 100% American work environment. But in the meantime, I just wanted to recognize all the things that I've grown to love over the past 15 years. So with the jobs that I have had, or the roles that I've taken on during my time here, I have been fortunate to kind of have a mix. I've never worked, I would say, solely with residents or people from Latin America. It's usually been I'd say 80-20. So a big portion of my group or my team is made up of Latin Americans, whereas maybe 20% is made up of people from North America and sometimes a little bit of Europe. So that's why I think I've also been able to see the distinct difference just in how I am, how I feel comfortable, or how I move, let's say, when I'm with the Latin American team versus when I'm with my American or North American, including Canada, and European counterparts. So I'd say the first thing is the emotional connection with workers. I struggled with this. I struggled with this even in the US. I have always been a very reserved person coming from a Caribbean background where, yes, you just say what's necessary. You don't offer more, especially in an official setting than needed. And I usually share with team members how one time I started a job, and at the time my daughter was almost 2, and it was about a month or 2 in before my coworkers even found out that I had a daughter. So of course that type of thing didn't come up in the interview, and it just never felt like a topic of conversation. It wasn't asked of me. Nobody asked me outright, hey, do you have children? So it never came up. But I can't imagine that ever happening in Latin America, or even I can also see the influence that it's had in how I interact with anyone at this point. I do value a lot more sharing personal information, of course with limits, but it gives you a full picture. And I've actually seen that change even with, for instance, on LinkedIn. You often have that struggle where people are sharing personal parts of their lives, even though the platform is intended for job searching and professional development. But people also know that, I'm not just my title, I'm not just my job. So if I'm going through a hard time, caring for aging parents, or I just lost my pet, I think it makes sense to share that on this platform as well. I think the jury's still out. I can see both sides of the argument, but I know over the past 15 years, I have become a lot more comfortable sharing that type of information and not seeing it as overly personal or something that is none of anybody else's business. It is. For instance, if my child needs me or gets sick or whatever the case may be, that's my priority. So it's helpful for them to know that going in. So I think the struggle for me, even growing in that way, is just seeing how team members really care for each other. And it's hard to describe, because I don't want to make it seem like, when people become, or coworkers here stay friends forever. Although I've seen cases, it does happen, but I know it happens in the US as well. It just depends on, the situation and all of that. But we know for the most part, you work with people for a while, and while you're working with them, you can be very close and share a lot. But then once you don't have that proximity and you're, in different organizations, or you're not seeing each other every day, it's hard to maintain that unless, there was really a genuine friendship. So that said, again, recognizing that that exists too. It doesn't mean that, oh, for some reason people here, once they work together, that bond is unbreakable. But there is another reason why I think those friendships last longer. I'll get to that on a different point. But I think in the way that they care for each other and want to support each other personally and professionally. And I'm not speaking to people who work in retail or, this is more quote unquote office setting type jobs a lot of government jobs. I've even seen it. I've had the opportunity. Usually when you go to a government office here, you're going to be there a while and you could pick up on it. At least I do. I observe people a lot, their behaviors, and when people come in and the little chats that they have that I think can sometimes be annoying for those who are waiting for services. But I also see that as this is a good team. This is a team that has a good rapport, and it may not reflect in efficiency in how we would want it to be reflected, especially in American business setting. But I think it's nice. I think it makes so that going to work isn't such a burden and people don't feel like, ugh, which you hear a lot in the US. Never to generalize. I'm sure that there are people who are unhappy in their work situations. I'm sure there are people who are unable to connect with their coworkers too. But it's just in simple settings, whether it's a bank, whether it's the tax office or even the supermarket. You sense that people will make, like, you can be, for instance, at the supermarket, at the checkout counter, and the person is, checking, like taking your items, ringing you up, and then a coworker shows up, just starting his or her shift, and the coworker will come, usually, and people here greet with a kiss, and will chat, and sometimes the cashier will stop what he or she is doing just to chat with that coworker, and the expectation is that that's okay, is that you're gonna wait. And I think that's nice. And I don't know if it's because I've been here so long. It doesn't bother me because I can also appreciate two humans connecting and wanting to take the 10, 15 seconds to say, how's your mom doing? Or how's the kid, if a kid was sick or whatever it may be. So there's that. And I mentioned government office, all of that, but even in the work that I do, which is more international development type stuff, you see it too. And I think more so in the work that I do, because especially when it comes to humanitarian work, you're often away from family, or you're in stressful situations, or just difficult settings with your coworker. So I think that also leads to this bond, and the jokes, that's the other thing. And I don't know if it necessarily falls into the emotional connection, but yeah, usually if you're feeling comfortable with somebody, you relax more and you can tell jokes. The jokes that get told, the sort of, so I think a lot of Latin American humor is based on poking fun at people, and somebody is skinny and they get called flaca, or somebody who's a little overweight gets called gorda or gordo. So they're, I think, just really anchored in the culture is not to take ourselves seriously. And you see that even, again, when you hear people, the way that they joke with each other and the level of comfort they have, the kind of jokes that they're making, that in the beginning I would sort of cringe because I think, like, is that okay? Is that not offensive? Is it okay to make that kind of joke? And then sometimes I would just know, okay, well, they have that rapport, they have that level of, but it's very common to develop that really quickly. You don't have to know the person a year to get to that level of comfort. You become part of that fold. And I have seen situations where people will say, hey, don't joke with me like that, or I'm not comfortable hearing that kind of thing. That people do set limits too, but the default seems to be, hey, let's just tell inappropriate jokes and make fun of each other, and that's okay, and that just reflects how comfortable we are with each other and the level of trust that we have. I think so. And this is not necessarily a downside to the emotional connection, but one downside that I do see come across is that it's still very hierarchical. So what does that mean when I'm talking about the camaraderie and the joking and all that? That doesn't necessarily happen with someone that's considered a boss, somebody that has gerente or jefe in their title, and that to me is sad, because I for my leadership style is very much collaborative, and even though yes, technically the buck has to stop with someone, I don't ever think that I know everything and I'm the smartest person in the room. I love the sharing of ideas and debating things, and like, tell me what you think, and if you disagree with me, and that's hard to push through because of the traditional hierarchical structure that still is very apparent here. I mean, you'll even see some places that the boss doesn't get called by his or her first name. It's jefe or jefa. Like, it's, that level of like separation and quote unquote respect that exists. So yeah, there's that, which I think is sort of the flip side to how well you see coworkers connect. So the next point, and to me they're all somehow linked, but is just, you don't have to worry so much about liabilities. And I think hearing the inappropriate jokes sometimes, or even going out for drinks with your coworkers, I know that still happens, obviously, in the US. But one thing I think that has become much more strict is like company ordained drinking. So when I was young and would go to my mom's job, every Friday there was happy hour in the office. So they would order snacks, and there would be wine. And I even remember, because again, culturally, but yeah, my mom would let me sip, and her coworkers would be like, what? But that aside, that doesn't happen anymore. I remember the last place that I worked in the US, it was when we did have sort of like Christmas lunches or dinners or anything like that, it was done in a way that it was clear that it was disconnected from work. So it wasn't ordained per se. And it, whether it's we meet on a Saturday or it never is right after work. It was never we leave the office and head to the bar, but that still happens here. It's very, very common. And because of, again, the close relationships that exist with coworkers, maybe sometimes it's just, the bosses that do it amongst themselves, but sometimes it's, the bosses including the team, and it's like, yeah, let's go have a drink. Now, I guess another point is people driving is not... People, of course, a lot of people do drive, but I think when it comes to work, you do see people, I would say the majority take public transportation. So there's not as much of a risk of, oh, we've gone to a company ordained happy hour and now I'm driving drunk. And even if that happened though, I really think, now again, speaking only for Ecuador, I don't think that it would automatically get blamed on the company as it would in the US. People are not as litigious. So that doesn't, and maybe there's a law where you could actually, win that case, but it's just, you don't hear that happening. There is this sense of, you're an adult, you've made that decision. You've made the decision how much to drink. And if you've drank too much and then got behind the wheel, those consequences are yours. So there's that. Now, the flip side of, people not being litigious is there are still a lot of unchecked inequities and violations. Not necessarily labor laws. They have great labor laws, much more stringent and much more worker protected than in the US. But I would say there's sexual harassment going on, and people don't necessarily know the vehicle, or they don't feel empowered to speak up and then pursue legal action in that case, or even file an official complaint with HR. I think that those things are starting to happen little by little, but it's not. So the Me Too movement didn't reach here in that sense. Like I saw not long ago a documentary about Spain and some of the assaults that were going on, not necessarily in the workplace, but that in general would happen and not get reported or not get prosecuted. And there was this sense that like Me Too had reached there. But yeah, no, I was here the whole time that, that was happening in the US. And there was definitely never a sense of, oh yes, women here are feeling empowered and are starting to speak out and are starting to pursue legal action when something happens. So there's that. I think the another advantage, and it is somewhat linked to people not being litigious and not always thinking of this has to go to court or somebody has to get sued, but there's always this spirit of cooperation and resourcefulness. And sometimes to a fault, that team members will figure things out. Team members will, when there's an obstacle, when the thing, and these can be some serious or very difficult situations, especially in the work that I do, and yet they still will be very creative and think of a way to persevere. And I think the situation may not even exist in that same way in the US, probably less of a difficult situation. And yet, sometimes people will feel like, okay, I don't know what to do. This is a challenge for me. I need somebody to kind of help me figure this out. And yes, I've seen it time and time again, and in various situations where people just really think of innovative solutions in terms of how to get past something. And then so that also kind of creates a really fun dynamic. Like you're always on your, at least for me, because part of my role is to think of the risk and to hopefully minimize them. But I feel like my team members often keep me on my toes because of that, because they're so used to being able to kind of wing it and whatever it takes to get it done. Then I come in and go, wait a minute, like we got to think of does the risk outweigh the benefit here, or not? But it really, to me, it just speaks to the commitment and how passionate people are about the work that they do. And I've seen it in just the simplest things. And it's not only when it comes to, responding to a humanitarian crisis, just little things that people will figure out a makeshift solution, even if it's temporary, so that we can get the job done. I don't necessarily have a downside to, well, I think I mentioned it. The downside is just making sure that we're not doing anything illegal and that we're not putting any undue risk on any team members or on the organization itself. But it's knowing that team members will go out on a limb. You just learn to manage it. And then I'd say lastly, there's less turnover. And in my position, that it is a good thing. It is definitely a good thing. Any organization that has stability with its team members, it's an advantage, right? Longevity in a workplace is valued here more so than in the US. And I think it's because the mentality of like the next best thing, and I can do more, and I don't know. It is rooted obviously in fewer opportunities, that you just didn't have the an abundance of places or things that you could move to. But that's even with the change, even with remote work now, where people have access to a lot more opportunities that they didn't have before. There's still this sense of, I'm here, I'm settled, where am I going? And it still baffles me to the point when I see a person, usually it's a younger person, Gen Z specifically, who doesn't think that way and who is kind of moving and shaking and looking for the next best thing. I'm always like, well, you're an anomaly. Like, where are you getting this from? And it may be influenced, like there's so much cultural permeation, people are accessing information and dynamics from other places, especially when you work with a global team, and you're seeing as well amongst your global team a lot of rotation, a lot of people either moving on, changing departments and all that it becomes less of a weird thing for you. But I'd say across the board, it's still very much like you don't change jobs a lot unless absolutely necessary. I think it's also what also kind of allows that are the labor laws. So they protect employees so much that for an organization, the process sometimes, unless the person has done something egregious, which obviously then there's not as many protections for that. But if it's just like low performance and things like that, you're going to figure out a way versus discarding the team member as easily as you could in the US, let's say, or Canada, or I think it's the same. It's a similar dynamic in France. I have a family member who lives and works in France, and she often tells me how much she has to put up with team members because of the labor laws, because how difficult it is to fire someone. So there's that. Now, obviously the flip side or the downside to that I've seen is just there's fewer opportunities, and that's something I learned when I first came, because of there's somewhat of a bubble when it comes to the type of work that I do. It's a specific field with specific skill set and experience, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, you're not gonna see a lot of vacancies because Ecuadorians don't move from those jobs. Like it's a similar dynamic. Like you're in this position, usually you've worked up to that, and then what may happen is you will move laterally to another organization, but you're not going to necessarily leave that place and then go to, let's say, an organization that's outside of Ecuador. So it just makes the pool a lot smaller, and it's just harder to find an opening, especially as you go up in the hierarchy. But I think again the advantages of having stability and having people that really know the organization, there's a lot to be said for that. At the same time, I think the American in me is innovation and having new thoughts and new ideas. Like you can become stale staying in a position for a long time. So I see it as a challenge, just knowing that dynamic and never coming from the place of like, we need to change it and we need to make it more Americanized. It's more, well, how do you incite your team members who will be there a while to continuously innovate, to continuously grow? How do you provide those resources so that they don't become stale and they don't, things don't become monotonous for them? So there's that. And that is it for my list. Now, there are plenty other great things about working in Latin America, but those are my top few. And of course, there's always balance to things, right? Nothing is perfect, but it's really made for a beautiful experience for me. I'm so honored and grateful to have that shift and to be able to compare and hopefully bring some of the like the best of both worlds going forward. So let me know if you have any questions about these great experiences that I've had, or if you yourself have had some great experiences working outside your culture. That's all for this episode. Until the next time, be well.